with climate models. And our first speaker, well, first let me say, please reserve some time at the end of your talk for questions. Questions can also be entered in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can before the time is up. And I guess we'll get started with our first speaker, Lauren Gregoire from Leeds University. She will be telling us today about exploring the complex uncertainties in coupled climate ice simulations of the last glacial maximum. So I'm going to stop my share.
Thank you, Esther.
Yeah.
So I can share now. So hi everyone, and thank you for having me. Well, it's the evening for me, but it might be the morning for a lot of you. So I want to present some of the initial results from a project that I mentioned actually last year. We were just starting out. So we're essentially trying to explore the complex uncertainties that we come across and that can cause some issues in modeling the coevolution of climate and ice sheets, and specifically looking at the last glacial maximum here. So the work that I'm going to show is mostly done by Lachlan Asphalt and Niall Gandhi, the two postdoctoral researchers on my UKRI Future Leaders Fellowship. And more recently, Sam Sheriff-Tadano has joined us from Japan, and starting with another collaborative project with Ruja Ivanovic, Robin Smith, and Jonathan Gregoire. We're using the same similar tools. So the challenge really is when we model the coevolution of climate and ice sheets, is that when we compare our model outputs to observations, we want something realistic. We might come across some difficulties in simulating ice sheets that look like reconstructions. And most of the time it's because small biases that exist either in the ice sheet models or the climate models are amplified by the strong feedbacks between the ice and the climate. And in fact, there's large uncertainty in this work. And ideally, we want to put error bars on the models and produce some probability distribution of our projections, whether it's simulating past events or future. But the primary uncertainty here is in the climate, and it's very complex. It's got structure in time and space, and the current methods that we have from artificial intelligence can't cope with this complexity yet. And this is the work we're doing right now, is developing some new techniques to handle this. The models we're using here is the famous ice. So it's coupling between the famous general circulation model and two ice sheet models, Glimmer and Bicycles. So famous is a low resolution general circulation model, and we can run at least 500 model years per day and several simulation on one node of the up-to-date high-performance computers. So we can not only run simulations of timescale relevant to the ice sheets, but also hundreds of simulations at the same time. And what we're working with at the moment is running only the atmosphere, even though famous has got dynamical ocean, dynamical vegetation as well. We're prescribing the ocean, and I'm going to show you how we're doing that and the techniques we developed for this. And we've also started to run with a slab ocean. And the idea here is to try and control or have more of a control on what happens in the surface conditions through the ocean, to compensate for some biases that occur in all general circulation models. So it's a little bit of a philosophy of data assimilation through the surface ocean conditions. Glimmer, you'll be familiar with. Here we're using the shallow ice approximation version, very fast simulations to run lots and lots of ensembles of experiments and train some emulators. We're also using the Bicycles ice sheet model, much more complex model and very efficient. It's got an adaptive mesh that adjusts resolution through the simulation. And I think we can now describe it as an intermediate complexity marine ice sheet model. So it's not got the full complexity of the equations we need to resolve everything dynamic-wise in an ice sheet, but enough approximations to be able to represent the important processes. And the calculation of the surface mass balance is done in a very similar way to, I believe, what's in CESM, through energy mass balance calculations done at 10 elevation through the atmosphere. And we do some linear interpolation to downscale the surface mass balance onto the higher resolution of the ice sheet model. And there's two papers describing this coupling. So one in GMD discussion at the moment from Robin Smith and Jonathan Gregoire in the cryosphere. So as I mentioned, we want to control the surface ocean condition to reduce some bias and also address the uncertainty in the climate. So we needed a way to generate ensembles of plausible sea surface conditions using the best information we have from data and from model simulations. Sorry, I haven't had a chance to put the references here. This is really work in progress. But essentially, we're using the Margot dataset of sea surface temperature reconstructions for the last glacial maximum with some newer reconstructions from Southern Ocean. And ensembles of simulations from PMIP3 and PMIP4 last glacial maximum simulations. But here, what we want to do is not only update or reconstruct the sea surface temperature, but also at the same time, the sea ice conditions, in particular, the sea ice concentrations, or you might call it the sea ice fraction. These are the two things we need to drive our atmosphere model. And also not just an annual mean, but a monthly data set of climatology for sea surface temperature and sea ice concentrations. So there exist some methods. I'm going to go through the principle of the methods to do this and to somehow merge the observations and the ensemble of model simulations. And these have been applied by statisticians for CMIP simulations to get our best estimate of surface air temperature, for example. But the novelty here is to do this for both, for two variables at the same time, not just temperature, but temperature and sea ice. So this is through a process or method of exchangeability. And it's using methods of Bayes linear. I'm not going to go into the details, but it's similar principles of what you get when you do ensemble Kalman filter, if you're familiar with these principles. So the top left figure here shows the multimodal mean of sea surface temperatures. And what we do is we pull that information, so pull the model sea surface temperature towards the data where we have the data. And we get what we have at the top right, which is the mean sea surface temperature from our reconstruction. And the bottom left here shows the difference between the two. So essentially the correction that we do through producing this reconstruction. And the beauty of using statistical methods is that we get information on the uncertainty. And this is what you get at the bottom right, where you have higher uncertainty, where we have less data available and tighter constraints around the areas where we have a lot of data. And in fact, I'm going to show you later, but this is a map, but there's much more information than just a map. There is how the variance in different grid cells are connected to each other based on the information from the multimodal ensemble. But what about sea ice now? So this works with sea surface temperatures. And what we're doing here is using the same ensemble of PMIP3 and PMIP4 simulations to learn the relationship between sea surface temperature and sea ice. And we do this at every grid cell, because there is some complexity here, and there are other processes involved than just the fact that sea ice melts when it's warm or forms when it's cold. So we learn a parametric regression, essentially, of the relationship between here, the vertical axis is sea ice concentration and horizontal axis is sea surface temperature. So we learn these curves from each individual model at each grid cell. And so we end up with this ensemble of learning the relationship. And this allows us to then, from the reconstructed sea surface temperature, also have access to a reconstructed sea ice concentration that is compatible with these sea surface temperatures. And also we then filter out any results that suggest, for example, no ice at all in the Arctic, so that we have some handle on plausible results. But actually what we found is we've got some reconstruction of maximum sea ice extent in the Southern Ocean. Again, sorry, I have not been able to pull out the references, but that our reconstruction generates sea ice, maximum sea ice in the Southern Ocean that looks a lot like the reconstructions without us having to filter out the results or tweak the results in any way further. So it's quite a powerful method. So that's a way to sort of reconstruct sea surface temperatures and sea ice conditions. But what we want to do is actually generate plausible sets of sea surface temperature and sea ice based on this reconstruction. And we do this by using this variance covariance matrix that comes out of our methods. And I show you the map here is essentially what's on the diagonal of this matrix, but around within that matrix is a relationship, spatial relationship in the variance, in the uncertainty, if you like. And so what we do is decompose this with principal component analysis, EOF, these kind of methods, and only select the directions of maximum variance, and also get rid of any of the patterns that have very small patterns of variance, because here we're interested in changes in sea surface conditions that will have a noticeable effects on the North American ice sheet and other continental ice sheets and marine ice sheets too. So this is our methods then. We produce sea surface temperatures from the reconstructed mean and the linear combination of the selected principal components, and we can randomly sample these parameters to produce ensemble of results. Right, and now we've got a way to sample through uncertain sea surface conditions. We can use this to run a coupled atmosphere ice sheet model. And so I'm showing you here some really preliminary results that show some interesting behavior. So this is simulating Greenland ice sheet only at the last glacial maximum. We're starting from a present day Greenland ice sheet condition, and we're running our simulations for 5,000 years. And the difference, so we've got an ensemble, I think, of 50 or so simulations. The only difference between them is those sea surface temperatures and sea ice concentration fields. And what we find is a range of ice sheet behaviors. In some simulations, we have a larger ice sheet, which is what we expect at the last glacial maximum, but we even have simulations with smaller ice sheet than present day. And in the case of the simulation that has the higher ice sheet volume, we find that actually this is due to higher snowfall rather than a reduction in the summer melting. So as you can see, this is really a work in progress. Again, we've not quite adapted our plots. But then the bottom simulation here has got, in this case, a reduction in snowfall leading to a lower ice sheet volume. So this is all work that Niall Gandy's produced. And so generating this ensemble of simulation is what we need as our primary goal, is to generate, to create SMBGen, which is our surface mass balance generator. And our big ambition here is to replace famous or any other general circulation model with a fast and clever statistical model of the surface mass balance of ice sheets that we can couple with an ice sheet model to run large ensembles of past and future ice sheet simulation. So this is the goal. And the next step here is to learn how to statistically emulate surface mass balance in multiple dimensions. So to summarize, we're tackling problems of uncertainty and biases in coupled climate ice sheet models. Here we've chosen philosophy of data assimilation through the surface ocean condition. And we're using a method based on Bayes linear to jointly reconstruct sea surface temperatures and sea ice conditions and sample ensemble of plausible states. We're now running more ensembles of coupled famous ice simulations with Northern Hemisphere ice sheets. And later on, we'll be simulating the full deglaciation and also events like the 8.2 kilo events with the bicycles ice sheet model, both with fixed ocean and also slab ocean. And finally, we're working on some Gaussian process simulation of either just ice sheet volume or three-dimensional surface mass balance. And the real ambition here is to develop these tools so we can quantitatively relate past and future ice sheet evolution. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. We do have some questions. We
Fantastic.
have some hands raised. I saw Andreas first. I think you can, yes, go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, hi, Andreas.
Greetings from Corvallis.
Yeah, fantastic.
So it looks like you have kind of reconstructed global surface temperatures from a combination of data and models. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And so how does this compare with like the recent Tierney et al. Reconstruction, where they also used the 018 data and came up with a much colder global surface temperature than the Margot?
Yeah, so that's something that we've not had time to do yet. We want to do that comparison. There's a couple of differences. Well, I think in the method there are some statistical differences in how we do things. I'm told there are some statistical differences. I've not been able to really compare those equations, but also we use an ensemble from PMIP. So there are more model simulations. We've not got the oxygen isotopes within that reconstruction. So there are different information, but at the same time, we incorporate information from sea ice concentration, sea ice extent. So it will be very interesting to compare those results eventually.
Do you know what you get like for global surface air temperature change?
Well, we don't.
That Anand et al. They get something like 4 degrees, and now I think Tierney gets something like 6 degrees. So that's quite a big difference.
That's quite a big difference. Yeah. No, we don't. So we can't compare the surface air temperature because our reconstruction only produces sea surface temperatures. But we could compare. We can make some comparison of sea surface temperatures. Yeah. So the bottom line is not yet. I should also say, if anyone's got any more PMIP4, PMIP3, any LGM simulations, we're very interested in that data because recently we've noticed we need monthly sea surface temperatures and sea ice concentrations from model simulations because working with the climatologies that we find on some of the databases isn't sufficient to produce that robust correlation between sea surface temperatures and sea ice concentration. So we're still assimilating some of the data, and we've recently received some CESM data. So we'll be updating our results soon.
Thanks.
I think we can maybe take one more question, and I know there's one in the chat also, but Gunther, I saw Gunther's hand raised next. Gunther Legui.
Yeah, thanks. Nice talk. I was curious about more ice sheet results here. Especially in the plot where you show the evolution of the volume of ice. Did you separate this plot to see like bicycle versus glimmer response?
So no, not yet. So this is only glimmer, and so we've just about been able to simulate to use bicycles coupled with famous. We've got some, technical challenges going from a model that just runs on a single processor to a coupled model. So these results will be coming up in the next year. I expect we'll be able to do that. And so far we haven't got some coupled simulations, for example, with the Eurasian ice sheet, because Glimmer's not up to the task, I think, of simulating the Eurasian ice sheet.
And the second question is like, at what resolution do you run your ice sheet?
So this is a good question. If Niall's here, he might be able to say what resolution of the Greenland ice sheet. I'd expect something like 5 kilometers so far. But okay, so with bicycles, we're much more flexible with the resolution, and we tend to have a base resolution of either 20 or 10 kilometers, and we can go down several levels of refinement, so 3 or 4 levels of refinement up to a couple of kilometers resolution. So yeah, there's some great flexibility in how we can do that.
Okay. I think we should move on to the next talk, but there is a really good question in the chat. Maybe Lauren can chat.
I can have a look at that, no problem.
Yeah.
And so we should move on to our next speaker, who is Miran Vizcaino from Delft University. Her title is Simulation of LGM Ice Sheets, Climate, and SMB with CESM2 CAM5.
Okay, I'm gonna share again, because I was sharing before unmuting myself and then I couldn't do it. Sorry for that. Okay. Okay, so I'm very happy to present this work that is mostly analysis from my colleagues at TU Delft and University of Sheffield. And all this work is also done in collaboration with many people at NCAR. We have been receiving support, technical support, and also advice on these simulations from many folks at NCAR. Here, our target is to simulate the climate, the SMB, and the ice streams of the LGM Northern Hemisphere ice sheets. So this is a target in itself. So we are interested in investigating the ice sheets at the LGM, but it's also the starting point for simulations of the last deglaciation. When we started, a main question or a main challenge was in how do we initialize? How do we, because this is our starting point for the last deglaciation simulation, so how do we initialize? How do we assume equilibrium or pseudo-equilibrium, or how do we go with that? And that was a priori. Then many other questions came up. And our approach here is going to be to first perform a climate and SMB simulation with the community system model. Then we force the ice sheet model with CESM forcing. And that can be, the SMB can be elevation dependent through the elevation classes calculation. And the final step is going with a coupled simulation. So we started this work with the standard CESM2 that includes CAM6, of course, and the initial condition was from a previous CESM1 simulation. So we take temperature and salinity, and we spin up the velocities from 0. After a century, we ran a 500-year CLM only simulation, so the land model only, to spin up the the snow and fern, as we have fern capability as well. So this implies many layers and a long time to spin up. And also we introduce LGM vegetation as simulated by Biomi. For that, we needed several adjustments to translate the biome information to CESM. And for the ocean, we needed several adjustments for the overflow and also in the bathymetry, because we had a much expanded Greenland ice sheet as compared to present day, and this was narrowing too much the strait and giving a lot of problems with the overflow. Okay, so this is the reconstruction that we were using. It is none of the reconstructions that are proposed to be used within PMIP. It is a mixture of several reconstructions. So for the duration, we have a dated one for the for this part, for the Barents and the Fennoscandian. And for the British from the consortium British Isochronel. Then for the Greenland ice sheet, the reconstruction is indicated here. And then for the North American ice sheet complex, it is a reconstruction that is similar to Black one. Okay, so we ran, and after 400 years, we stopped because this was going too cold, extremely cold. So we were totally out of range of observations. And then we consulted at NCAR. We also had a small side problem that was the buildup of very thick sea ice here and a couple of other locations, but mainly here in Baffin Bay. Okay, so we were advised motivated by research by Jian Zhu and others, we were advised to change to CAM5. So we replaced the atmospheric model, and we were leaving all of the rest of the infrastructure as it was. This is the motivation for this change, so that these are simulations that are in press, I believe, in GRL. So this was a simulation for the LGM with CAM6, and when CAM6 was replaced by CAM5, then the global cooling was within the approximate estimate. So as it should be. So so this is because of the very high equilibrium climate sensitivity of CESM2. Okay, so the first thing that we did, or Raymond Cerefold did, he asked the climate from these simulations from Jian and check the differences between CAM5 and CAM6 over the ice sheets. So this is the calculation of the SMB in both cases, and we would prefer the simulation from CAM6 because the SMB is too low with CAM5. You can see this very high ablation. Anyway, so Raymond was comparing fluxes. Technically, there were some issues in that CLM was producing the standard output and not per cover type, so we could not isolate the variables that correspond to glaciers. So, and this is very important in the ablation area, where half of the grid cell can be ice sheet and not the other half. And okay, so some issues to make a budget altogether. But the goal here was to see, well, if we are changing to CAM5, is it gonna go wrong? And we found very big differences between CAM5 and CAM6, but they could be explained by the difference in the global cooling, no? That was much higher in CAM6, and that so for instance here the sensible heat flux was very high or is very high in CAM5, but compared with CAM6, but of course temperatures are much higher in the case of CAM6. Of CAM5, and yeah, this explains that. So we were happy with the first test, and as a second test, we wanted to transition to our reconstruction that is different than the one that was used in this climate simulation by Gian. So we did a CLM run where we were using forcing from that simulation from Gian. And because our reconstruction is different, things didn't work out. Because at particularly in the places where our reconstruction puts ice and there is ocean in the other reconstruction, and then the fluxes are totally, don't make any sense. So then we stopped testing and we went with the real thing. So again, we are using the initial condition from CESM 1. We are taking the span up snow and firn from the CESM 2 CAM6 simulation. We reset the snow cover outside the ice sheets. And now with Biomi, we do something different. We take it for the high, for the high and medium latitudes and middle latitudes, we take Biomi, but for the rest, we take the default pre-industrial that is in the model. So because we didn't want to mess with the vegetation in the tropical region, for instance. So we did some SMB tuning. For instance, we reduced the rain to precipitation fraction through a temperature correction. We play a little bit with higher ice albedo, and with the bathymetry, we closed Baffin Bay to avoid the sea ice towers. So this is an illustration of what we were doing with the vegetation. This is as it is in pre-industrial for the shrubs, boreal shrub. And this is as is simulated by Biomi, and then the combination is giving us this final thing. Okay, so then we went with the simulation for real. It is this red line. And we have now more than 100 years, but here you see the first 100. And you can see the near surface temperature. We are good here. And at year 70, we also branch simulation with orbitals corresponding to 26K. To see the sensitivity to that. Okay, so this is the evolution of the NAMOC in both runs. It goes up quite a lot at the beginning in the spin up, and then declines as it should be. And here we are checking whether the closure of Baffin Bay here gives any problem, and we see that the surface speed makes sense. It's similar to the run that we had with CAM6, except for this part, because it is closed now. And we check mixed layer depths, all okay. In the 26K run, we found something strange with the sea ice extent. So we, in general, we were the simulation looks okay. We found something strange here. We found this spot with like a gigantic polynya here with no ice, no sea ice. This is concentration of 0, and we could not find whether this is modeled by others as well, or whether this can have any relationship with winds from the ice sheet or something else. And this is, the most important plot probably is coming now. So this is the simulation of SMB that we have right now. To mind that we have not equilibrated yet. with the climate. But this is what we get by year 90, more or less. This is the SMB. The accumulation area is relatively, well, very, very small in the British ice sheet, which is not a surprise. We think it will be a bit bigger as we advance, because the NAMOC probably will continue going down, and then we will have colder temperatures probably here, and a little bit of expansion of the accumulation area. In Greenland, we don't simulate ablation, so it is really cold. The margin of the Scandinavian ice sheet looks okay. We are worried about this very wide ablation area that in the 21K simulation, very wide ablation area for the Laurentide, but mind that this is in the grid of the climate model. This is in the grid of CLM. So now we are going to see things in downscale to the ice sheet grid. We don't see by now very large differences with the 26K simulation, but we haven't run many years of that yet. Yeah, still the sign of things is correct. So the SMB is higher in the case of the of 26K, as the orbitals are colder. Okay, so we have a comparison here between the 21K and 26K simulations, and this is per ice sheet, no? So for the Laurentide altogether, the SMB is negative, quite negative, and we don't like that. But this is calculated over the topography of the reconstruction, and this is a reconstruction that is that doesn't consider glaciological modeling. It is a reconstruction that is based on glacial isostatic adjustment. So we need to run the ice sheet model, smooth the topography, and then recalculate our SMB. Because we will see why. Then for Greenland, the SMB is larger than the present day, because the snow and ice melt is very low, and all of the snow melt is refreezing. So we don't have ablation here. The accumulation is lower than present day, regardless of a much bigger area. So all makes sense, it's consistent with a drier climate. And we get a positive SMB for the Barents. We are happy there, positive for the Scandinavian, and negative for the British, which is not a big surprise. So we are more worried here with the Laurentide, and the Iceland is positive as well. So all is positive except the Laurentide, which is the big one. So we're going to look a little bit more into the Laurentide. So we took this forcing and very we just forced the ice sheet model with that. We are cycling, so this forcing is elevation dependent, so we can use this SMB that depends on elevation, and as the elevation is changing, it will adapt.
3 minutes left before we.
Okay, so very quickly, what is going on? We are running 400 years only. We are not spinning, and we have not done a previous initialization of the ice sheet model. So it's just to test how things go when we are forcing with this SMB. And what we found was area retreat and thickening. The SMB is gonna go up as we lose the ablation areas that thin very rapidly. So this is the thinning that we have. So this is the SMB, and the topography lines at the beginning of the 400-year run. And when we get to the end, we have lost quite some area here. All these ablation areas are thinning up and are lost. And then because they are lost, our SMB becomes positive, of course. You can see that the topography is much smooth. Now, I have superimposed both things. Okay. So our conclusion so far, the change to CAM5 has improved the global simulation. We didn't see major problems. SMB seems in the low side so far when we calculate over the topography of the original reconstruction, but we are going to introduce the icing model and smooth up that and see how we go. We saw also that the 26 orbitals did not increase the SMB very much by now. And now, as the next steps, we are going to continue the climate simulation to equilibrium and analyze the climate and SMB, and start or continue our work with the icing model, initialize the icing model, do tuning with the sliding, and then with the target of doing analysis of the mass budget and the ice dynamics. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We have 1 minute for any quick questions, and then maybe the speaker can follow up in the chat. If there's any further questions.
I do have a quick question. Thank you, Miriam, for the interesting talk. How long are you planning to integrate the model?
So for the climate, probably something similar to Gian's simulation, so 400, 500 years.
Would that not be, I mean, you probably wanna achieve an equilibrium. Is that not a goal? I think 400 years may be too short.
Yes, but we cannot afford much more than that. So yeah, we will go with that. We are running here at 1 degree. It is really expensive.
Okay, I think we have one more question in the chat, and maybe Mirren can answer, and we can switch to our next speaker, who is Aaliyah Summers, who's now at Dartmouth College. And the title of her talk is Retreat and Regrowth of the Greenland Ice Sheet During the Last Interglacial as Simulated by the CESM2, CESM2 Coupled Climate Ice Sheet Model.
Yeah, thanks, Esther. So as Esther mentioned, I was working as a postdoc at NCAR previously. And so this was work that we started then and has been ongoing, and we're just kind of finishing up now. So it's nice to be able to present some of the results that have come out of this. And it's been a really big group effort. So many, many people involved, those listed here, as well as others also. Oops. All right, so I realize that many or most of you are familiar with the last interglacial period already. But in case some of you aren't, this is a period that's called the last interglacial, or the LIG for short, also referred to as the Eemian, or marine isotope stage 5E. And these names all refer to about the same period, from approximately 129,000 years ago to 116,000 years ago. And during that time, the Earth's climate was warmer than our present climate. And that's primarily due to differences in our orbital configuration during that time. And the main effect of that was a high summer anomaly in the Northern Hemisphere of insolation. So you can see in this plot here, on the bottom axis, it's starting from 140,000 years ago, moving forward in time. And then the left axis is showing month of the year. So if you look at this really hot spot in the middle, this kind of hottest portion is around 127,000 years ago in the summer. And so kind of the main effect of some of this summer insolation in the Arctic especially is that Arctic summer temperatures could be up to 3 to 5 degrees warmer than present. And of course, when you have warmer temperature, you're going to get changes in vegetation. And so that then changes the albedo further. So we get this strong feedback between vegetation distribution and albedo that pretty strongly affects the climate. And we'll look more carefully at that as we go. So why are we interested in studying the last interglacial? Well, it can be a useful period to look at as a warmer period in the Earth's past to help understand some of the behavior and feedbacks that take place in the Earth system that may be relevant to what we'll see in a warming future. And of course, it's not a perfect analog because circumstances are different, causes of warming are different, but there's a lot that can be learned from looking at these warm periods. During the last interglacial, sea level likely reached a high stand that was about 6 to 9 meters higher than our present sea level. So of course, as we're seeing dramatic loss from ice sheets and rising sea level currently, and kind of looking to what we might be able to expect, it's useful to understand how much of that sea level rise came from different parts of the cryosphere during the last interglacial. And it remains kind of an open question how much of the sea level rise during the last interglacial was due to contributions from Greenland melting versus contributions from portions of the Antarctic ice sheet collapsing or melting of mountain glaciers, thermal expansion, all the other reasons. And so previous estimates have varied quite a bit. In 2015, a nice summary from Dutton and others estimated, came up with a general estimate of about 2 meters coming from Greenland. And then in a subsequent study by Yao and others in 2016, they had put forth a much higher estimate of 5 or even more meters. So the goal of this work was to conduct a transient, fully coupled global climate simulation using the Community Earth System model with a fully dynamic Greenland ice sheet during the last interglacial. And I know many or most of you are familiar with CESM, but for those of you who aren't, it's composed of these different component models. So we have the community ice sheet model, which simulates the Greenland ice sheet for us in this case. There's the atmosphere model, land, ocean, and sea ice components. And these all talk to each other through a coupler. So there are feedbacks going on between every different component. So to design this long transient simulation, we decided to start at that hottest period around 127,000 years ago. And that was also chosen to be likely after some of the big Heinrich events. So that we're starting from an ice sheet similar to present day extent. And we run for 8,000 years to 119,000 years ago. And to do this, we impose a 5 times acceleration of the ice sheet model, CESM, as well as a 5 times acceleration of the orbital parameters. And that's relative to the other components, like ocean, atmosphere, land, sea ice. And so this lets us run it in a more computationally affordable way. So we're running a total of 1,600 fully coupled CESM years to achieve the total 8,000 ice sheet and orbital years. Now, I should mention that in the current CLM, the community land model, there's not a dynamic vegetation model that's incorporated. But as I mentioned before, the albedo vegetation feedback may be quite important during this warm period of the last interglacial. So what we did for this study was to change the vegetation every 500 years using a model called Biome 4, which generates biome distributions around the globe based on the climate. And the way that we do that, after each segment of running CESM, we extract monthly climatology data. And then the collaborators up in Oregon, Sarah Schaefer at USGS and Patrick Bartlein at University of Oregon, would run Biome 4 simulations and generate a new vegetation map. So then I would translate the biomes into corresponding plant functional types in CLM and create a new surface data set. And then we run the next segment. So by doing this, we are creating kind of a quasi-dynamic vegetation model, which is not, fully changing every year of the model, but still allows us to capture some of those important changes. So here is just an example of what one of these biome distributions looks like. And you'll notice here that we also have vegetation under the ice on Greenland. And so that was a neat thing that Sarah and Bart developed to be able to extrapolate the biome distribution based on latitude and elevation, so that as the ice sheet retreated, we would actually expose vegetation that would grow in there over the next 500 years. And so I'll just quickly scroll through a bunch of these maps moving forward through the simulation, and not so that you can look closely at them, but just that you can see that there are changes, especially in some of the forest distribution up in the north, like in northern North America and over in Russia. All right. So now we'll look at some results. So the last couple segments are just finishing up on Cheyenne, actually. Should be done in the next week or two. But we have results from 127 to 120,000 years ago. So 7 of our 8,000 years done. Now here are some plots showing how the ice thickness evolves through that time. And so you can see we start with an ice sheet that looks pretty similar to current day extent. And this is the spun up JGBG ice sheet from the land ice group that many of you worked on. And so it's slightly larger than present day, but it was spun up to equilibrium in thermal and dynamic conditions. So you notice that as we progress through time, it shrinks. And then we actually get a separation into northern and southern domes around 122,000 years ago. And then as the climate cools moving forward, it starts to regrow. And here's basically the same thing, but looking at the accumulation and ablation rates. So in this case, red is showing ablation, melt, where ice is being lost, and blue is showing net accumulation, where it's being gained. So you can see that as we first hit the ice sheet with this very hot climate, it's reducing pretty dramatically. And as it thins, you get these high ablation rates, especially in the southwest and up north. But notice that in the southeast, the accumulation rates actually stay quite high, as shown by this blue color. And so we see, the separation, and then as it starts to regrow, you have much less ablation, and it's thickening and regrowing an area. Same thing, just looking at surface velocity of the ice. Now, if we look at how that evolution goes in terms of ice fluxes, mass balance from the ice sheet. So what we see here is the total mass balance is shown in gray or with the mean shown in black to make it a little easier to see. So you can see that it starts off with a very negative mass balance. So when it's hit with the hot climate, it's going to be decreasing, losing mass. And then as we move forward in time, it reaches about a 0 mass balance around 122,000 years ago. And then as it's regrowing, of course, it becomes slightly positive. And then the different lines in here show the different component fluxes that compose that total mass balance. So in the turquoise or jade color, we have our calving flux. So you can see it decreases in magnitude a bit, and then you start to get more calving as the ice sheet grows out towards the margins again. The purple line is the surface mass balance. So you can see that it's initially negative, meaning we have more ablation than accumulation. And then as we cross towards that regrowth stage, we're getting more accumulation. And the coral colored line here is the basal mass balance. So that's basically basal melt. And relative to the other components, it stays quite small, although it does, of course, vary through time. Now, if we look at this in terms of ice sheet volume and ice sheet area, you can see that as we go through time, it decreases in volume or in area and reaches its minimum extent around 122 Ka, and then starts its slow regrowth. Now, the other line that's shown in here in green is from a companion simulation that we did without changing the vegetation distribution. So the blue one is where we change the vegetation every 500 years. And the green one is where we prescribe vegetation based on kind of the pre-industrial no anthro, so removing all crops and anthropological influence. And we keep that vegetation constant. And so you can see there's a very big difference here. So in this case, the ice sheet doesn't shrink nearly as much before it reaches its minimum quite a bit earlier and then starts to regrow. So this suggests that vegetation is quite important in accurately capturing the feedbacks between the climate and the ice sheet. Now here's a look at how this translates into sea level rise. So the top plot is showing sea level rise per year. Again, the blue line is for our main simulation where we do change the vegetation. And the green line is the one where we hold the vegetation constant. So the bottom plot is showing sea level equivalent. So you'll notice that we start at about 8.9 meters of sea level equivalent held in the ice sheet. And that's a bit bigger than present day, which has about 7.4 meters of sea level equivalent. But in our main run, the minimum ice sheet extent that occurs around 122 Ka is equivalent to about a 4.1 meter difference from this initial state of sea level rise. And so if you were to take that compared to present day, you could say it would be more like 2.6 meters compared to present day, since we're starting from a bigger ice sheet. But the point is that it loses about 4 meters of sea level equivalent during this last interglacial period in this simulation. And for comparison, the simulation where we hold the vegetation constant only loses about 1.5 meters sea level equivalent. And again, that minimum occurs much earlier, closer to 124 Ka. So to kind of summarize some of the findings, this new simulation provides a new estimate for the timing and magnitude of Greenland ice sheet retreat and contribution to sea level rise during the last interglacial. And it's one of perhaps the most sophisticated simulation to date using a very complex climate model coupled with a fully dynamic ice sheet model. And one of the key findings that we found that I've shown is that the global vegetation distribution plays a quite important role in climate interactions and how the ice sheet behaves. Now, I've focused pretty much all the results that I've shown here on ice sheet behavior, but this is a fully coupled run. And so we have many terabytes of data, and there's so much that can be pulled out of the simulation. So I guess, we would like to put the invitation out there to any of you who are interested in working with some of this, because there are many stories to tell, and I think a lot that could really be quite useful coming out of this data set. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks very much for listening.
Thanks, Aaliyah. And let's see, I see Gunter has his hand raised.
Hey, hi Leah, thanks for the presentation. Out of curiosity, you mentioned at the beginning of your talk the two estimations from two different papers. Do you know if those papers had used the evolution of the vegetation? Because you just showed that it has a huge impact. And so I was wondering if the lowest estimation that predict like 2 meters had vegetation at all.
Yeah, that's a great question. And someone who knows more may be able to correct me if I say something wrong. But I think that the studies that the Dutton et al. Summary, it was based on some modeling studies and I think observational studies, from like core reconstructions. And as far as I know, none of the modeling studies had used a fully dynamic vegetation model, but perhaps Betty or Marcus or Alex or someone may actually know more about that if I'm incorrect.
Thanks.
And Jean has a question.
Hello, Aliyah. Thank you for the nice talk. So I'm interested in the role of vegetation. So I have two questions. Firstly, what's the impact on global mean temperature between the two simulations?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I didn't put any of the figures into these slides, but in the paper that we're working up to submit soon, we will have some good plots that show just the spatial distribution as well, not just the global mean. But very generally, when we do change the vegetation, the global mean temperature is quite a bit hotter than holding the vegetation constant, which leads to that, further warming and retreat of the ice sheet.
Okay, so in another plot, you showed that with vegetation, the melting of the Greenland lags the simulation without vegetation by like 2,000 years. So you have this prolonged melting of Greenland ice sheets. Do you have any idea what's controlling this difference in terms of the memory here?
Yeah, well, it has a lot to do with, the vegetation distribution. And so as you get more forest into those northern boreal areas, you're going to have much lower albedo. And so that makes it quite a bit hotter. So in those plots that I showed, the one where we changed the vegetation, it reaches its minimum later, but it, is retreating for much longer. And so that's what's driving it a lot, is that albedo effect and the corresponding warmer temperature.
So the memory is in the ice sheet itself or through ocean?
I haven't looked carefully at the differences in the ocean. I know that I think Marcus has a student who's going to be looking at some of that. But certainly, the ocean would be affected somewhat, but a lot of it is just, I think, through air temperature and from the land surface temperature.
Okay, thank you.
That then affects the surface mass balance of the ice sheet.
There's a question from Alex Robinson.
Hi, yeah, Leah, thanks. It was really neat to see these results finally coming out, because I know it's been a big effort to get these simulations done, and it's quite innovative. I was curious on the side, because of course it's really interesting to see this 2.6 meter figure relative to present day. But I was curious if you had in mind what kind of maximum summer temperatures around Greenland you were getting.
Oh, that's a very good question that I should have in mind, but unfortunately I don't remember, and I would need to go look. But we can check, unless Betty happens to remember, or anyone else who's been looking at these data recently. Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Let's see, there's some questions also in the chat to Aaliyah. Let's see. Oops, there's a lot of questions in the chat, so we might need to follow up in the break, which we will be starting very soon.
Yeah, I can go through and respond in the chat.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think that might be the best for now.
Yeah, I think that's
so. We do have a break, and we return at 10:30 for 2 more talks. So I'll see you all back then. Thank you, speakers.
Okay, thank you.
Great talks this morning.
Esther, will you mind sharing that slide again? That's the agenda slide. Thank you.
I can do that. Let's see. Let me get it up first.
Esther, you are also announcing the other 2 talks, correct?
I don't know. I mean, I'm happy to have other co-chairs moderate the next session.
Esther, I'd be happy to if you'd like, or also.
Yeah, that would be great, Bill.
Would you like me? Okay.
It'd be good for a land ice co-chair to do that. But yeah, let me get this up.
Bill, I just made you a co-host, so you have the power of lowering hands.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to take a break now. I'll be back a few minutes before 10:30.
Yeah, we have a nice long break here.
Anyway, great set of talks so far. I'm
really great. Okay. Oh. Oops.
I can stop sharing when you want, whenever you need.
Oh, yeah, I didn't realize I hadn't shared. So
that's okay. I just did the quickest method I could to put the agenda up.
Do you want me to show the agenda or the welcome? I have the agenda here too.
Either one. Ryan just suggests the agenda. So if people jump
I have
on,
the agenda ready to go next to the share the air figure.
Okay, I'll stop sharing.
Oh, it says. Okay, let me do it again. Okay, I'm having trouble. Share screen. Is that working?
No, I still see you.
Oh, all right. Let me go back to this. Start over. Share. Okay, now I'm sharing. And there we go. Does that work? Oh, wait.
I see your notes.
I know. Okay. Did that stop it? Yeah. Oh my gosh. All right. I wonder if this is the problem. Okay. I clicked on the wrong. There we go. How's that?
I still see you.
You still see me? Oh. It's telling me screen sharing has failed to start. Now?
No.
Oh my gosh. Oh no. How's that?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. It's the order in which you click on things, I think.
Perfect.
I was starting the slideshow before I shared, and it didn't like that. So. Okay. And I can mute too. Okay, good.
Esther, would you like to go ahead and get started? Or give people another couple of minutes?
I think you're muted, Esther.
Esther, can you unmute, please?
Yes.
There
Sorry. I thought were you moderating? Didn't you say you were going to moderate this?
I was going to moderate the next couple of talks.
Yes. Okay. Right.
Would you like to go ahead and get started?
Yes. Yeah.
Great.
Let's do that.
Welcome back, everyone. We have two more speakers in this part of the session, and then we'll go to general discussion, which I hope you'll be able to stay around for. Our first speaker is Marcus Liverstrom of the University of Arizona, who'll be talking about the closure of Canadian Arctic gateways as a prerequisite for glacial inception in Scandinavia. Floor is yours, Marcus.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me?
Hear you fine, yep.
Okay, perfect, thank you. All right, thanks for organizing this conference. I know that the circumstances are kind of difficult right now, but it's great that we can get together like this and meet no matter what. So I'm going to talk about some a work that something I've been working on for the last several years. I think I started this project back in 2017 or something like that. So it's been a long process, but we're finally at the stage where I have a manuscript in review, and it's in review in Nature Geoscience. So hopefully it will be accepted there soon. Right. So I'm going to talk about glacial inception and how we can simulate that using a fully coupled Earth system model. But just to set the scene first, so when did the last glacial inception happen? Well, what I'm showing here is a time axis, time series going back from about 160,000 years ago to pre-industrial. And the top panel shows the July insolation at 65 degrees north. And the bottom panel shows the atmospheric CO2 concentration as a function of time. And you can see that I've highlighted a few things. So all the way over on the right, you can see that it says the LGM, which is the last glacial maximum. And then on the left, there is this gray band saying 116 Ka and inception. So this is the time period I'm trying to look at. So it's fairly well known that the last glacial inception happened, or it co-occurred with an insolation minima in the Northern Hemisphere summer. And that is really the most prominent feature of the inceptions. We have the very low insolation in the summer. Atmospheric greenhouse gases were more or less similar to pre-industrial. So you can see in the lower panel that the CO2 concentration was fairly stable, and then after the ice sheet started forming, that's when the CO2 concentration started going down. Okay, so again, just to set the scene a little bit, I think we've all seen figures similar to this one. It's a little bit of a low resolution figure, unfortunately, but it shows the ice sheet extent at the last glacial maximum, so about 21,000 years before present. The question is, so how do we go from basically modern ice coverage to, the ice coverage of the last glacial maximum? That's a somewhat hard question to answer for a few reasons. So one is that we don't actually know exactly where the inception happened. It's when the ice sheets started forming. And the reason is that the big ice sheets coming after the incipient ice sheets, they tend to abrade the landscape, and they basically just remove the more or less all traces of what happened before them. So we only have we don't have a full picture of the glacial history of the Northern Hemisphere in the last glacial cycle. But we do know where the last what ashes were at the last glacial maximum, and there's a lot of work going on trying to figure out what happened before that. So all hope is not lost yet. So what this figure is showing is that the dotted line is the extent at the last glacial maximum. Now you have two other lines showing the extent at stages prior to the last glacial maximum. So the one you should focus on here is the bold line, which shows the ice margin at maybe 10 to 20,000 years before present. And this is based on actual field data, so geological and geomorphological evidence. So you can see that we don't have a complete picture, but it's very likely that the inception happens somewhere inside of the confinement of these lines. So if I just highlight the most likely inception areas here, so in orange I'm showing the likely inception areas, and then in red I'm showing areas that we don't really have signs of big ice sheets, at least not during the early stages of the last glacial cycle. There are signs of smaller ice caps, but no major ice sheets. Okay, so it's very likely that the inception happened somewhere up in the northern Canadian archipelago, maybe in Quebec, along the Arctic margin in Siberia, on islands in Siberia and north of Scandinavia, but also in the Scandinavian mountains. Okay, so I'm going to try to tackle this problem using CESM2. And we've seen this picture before, so I'm not going to talk too much about it, but the novelty here is that CESM2 has an interactive ice sheet model, and it's more or less fully interactive with all other components of the Earth system model. So it's a great tool to use to try to tackle this problem. Okay, the problem is that the ice sheet model grid by default is restricted to basically to Greenland island. It's the default resolution is very high. It's 4 by 4 kilometers. So each grid cell is only 4 kilometers big. So it's a very high resolution. The problem, of course, is that if you want to simulate glacial inception, you need something that's a little bit bigger than just the Greenland islands. We need something, a grid that covers the northern hemisphere. And ideally, we want to have a grid with a similar resolution, so ideally 4 kilometers or even better perhaps, because the inception likely happen on mountain peaks. So by having a really high resolution, we can really get those initial seeds. Okay, I should also say that I'm going to start the simulation using a spun-up climate. It's a spun-up pre-industrial climate, but we also have a spun-up version of the Greenland ice sheet. So, and that if you're interested in that process, you can look at the paper listed here. Okay, so what can we do about the northern hemisphere? Well, so we have the default grid on the left. We want something bigger. So voila, this is my grid that I created. So this is the topography in the ice sheet model grid. So you can see that it kind of looks like a satellite photo, but it's actually the topography in the ice sheet model. All right, and I'm retaining the 4 kilometer resolution. So it's a good grid to use for this particular problem. Okay, so again, I'm starting from a spun up pre-industrial climate. And I'm adding the Greenland ice sheet, but I'm removing all other mountain glaciers because I want to bias the climate to, or the model to produce ice sheets where we have ice at present. I'm changing the forcing to be fixed at 116,000 years before present. So it's greenhouse gases, insulation, etc. I'm using modern vegetation, and I will talk briefly about that later. And that's it. So now we'll start the simulation. So this is what we start from, and as you can see, I'm gonna keep the default Greenland extent shown in gray like this. But after 200 years, this is where we have ice. So you can see that we have ice growing in the Canadian archipelago. We also have ice on the other islands in the Arctic, and there is some ice starting to grow in the highland regions of Siberia. And this is after 650 years. So this is, again, this is fully coupled. So the ice sheet model runs coupled to the rest of the climate model. So after 650 years, the ice distribution is more or less the same as before, but the ice is thicker. Okay, so we can make 4 key observations here. So one is that the insulation forcing alone is sufficient to drive inception in the Canadian archipelago. The Canadian archipelago, which is abbreviated as CAA here, is pretty much fully glaciated after a few hundred years like this. And you can see that the ice is also extending outside of the land in the archipelago. So we have a marine component as well. The next observation is that the gateways or the ocean straits in the archipelago, they're typically fairly deep. They're typically a few hundred meters deep, but they often have a sill, so like a shallow point. The sill depth is typically somewhere between 150 and 200 meters. So, you know, if we have an ice sheet that is 200 meters thick or so, then that will, you know, float on top of the water, but it's gonna go pretty much all the way down to the bottom, at least where we have the shallowest points in the straits. The last observation is that we don't see any ice growing in Scandinavia. Okay, so that's potentially a problem. And what's the reason for that? Well, I'm showing the June, July, August average surface temperature from the 116K simulation. You can see that northern Canada is cold, which is favorable for inception. Scandinavia is still pretty warm. And that's the reason why we don't see any ice growing there. If I'm comparing the surface temperature, summer surface temperature in this simulation with the pre-industrial control simulation, you can see that, you know, Scandinavia is cooler than in a pre-industrial simulation, but it's still, I'm arguing that it's still too warm. And it's the explanation, I'm going more into depth in the paper, but so I encourage you to look at that when it comes out. But you can see this warm anomaly kind of off the coast of Scandinavia, and that seems to be one of the key components of why we don't get any inception in Scandinavia using insulation forcing alone. Okay, so maybe we have some missing feedbacks. So the key one I've talked about briefly is the archipelago in northern Canada. And a few other things I'm not going to talk about here is, so I'm using a constant forcing, you know, relative to forcing should update transiently. I'm using pre-industrial vegetation. Aliyah has showed that, you know, vegetation is potentially really important for this kind of stuff. I've done some sensitivity simulations that suggest that the vegetation plays no role for this overall study, but I'm not going to talk about that here. So, but why is the archipelago so important? Well, so this is a top-down view of the Arctic, and in the modern climate, there's a net freshwater flux across Bering Strait. So the Pacific Ocean has a higher sea surface height than the Arctic side of Bering Strait, and there's also a difference in salinity between the North Pacific and the North Atlantic. So there's basically a net flux of water across Bering Strait, and that acts as a net freshwater flux into the Arctic, and then by extension into the North Atlantic. And this freshwater is routed through the Canadian Arctic archipelago, but also around the eastern side of Greenland through the Fram Strait. So you can imagine that if we put a big ice sheet in Canada, then we're closing off the freshwater flux through the archipelago. So this freshwater has to go somewhere, and the only place it can go is really out east of Greenland. The problem is that the deep convection regions in the North Atlantic happen to be east of Greenland and Nordic seas, but also in Labrador Sea. So we're basically just changing the whole freshwater budget of the Arctic and kind of the high latitudes in the North Atlantic by doing that. And so one technical aspect of this is that a model like CESM is not changing the land-ocean mask when the ice sheet model runs. So as far as the ocean model is concerned, the gateways in the Canadian Arctic archipelago are still open, even though we have a big ice sheet covering it. So I ran a separate simulation where I'm closing these gateways, and just to prove the point, I'm just closing a handful of grid cells just to kind of shut off the freshwater flux through the archipelago. So you can see the grid cells here in red that I'm closing. Okay, so I ran a simulation that I branched off from year 500 from the default simulation. I'm running 300 years, 300 additional years from the branch point. And because we have closed off the gateways, the salinity is routed, east of Greenland, and that starts to reduce the deep convection in the North Atlantic. So we get, by extension, we get a weaker AMOC circulation, which changes like the whole heat transport into higher latitudes. So this is the difference in surface temperature between the simulation with closed gateways with respect to the simulation with open gateways. You can see that we get this cold anomaly in the Nordic seas. And you can also see that Scandinavia becomes colder because of this cold anomaly. And that here is just a comparison between the two. So the cold anomaly is due to reduced heat transport, but also the expansion of sea ice that allows to get the albedo effect there. Okay, but the key thing here is that with this additional cold anomaly, we also start forming ice in Scandinavia. So this kind of suggests that we really need this ice sheet in northern Canada to form before we get these feedback processes in the ocean, which by extension gives you a cold anomaly over Scandinavia, and that enables us to form ice there. Okay, and then if we just compare this with the kind of theoretical picture I showed you before, we have ice in pretty much the right areas. I think there are a few places that kind of stand out. Perhaps we have perhaps a little bit too much ice in kind of eastern Siberia, but and less ice than the reconstruction suggested in Quebec. But other than that, I'm pretty happy with this. Okay, so the question is then, is there any truth to this whole thing? I mean, this is just a theoretical study using a climate model. And I argue that it is. There is some truth to this. So the top panel on the left shows insolation that we saw before, but zoomed in on the kind of the inception period. The red line shows the global sea level. So you can see that the global sea level started dropping after about 120 Ka or something like that. And then it went down to minimum around maybe 108,000 years before present. Okay, if we look at proxy data, so I'm going to show some dots on the map on the right. So you can see that there's a dot off the coast of Quebec. And the line on the left shows ice rafted debris. So this is basically like rocky materials transported by icebergs and then deposited on the seafloor. And you only get icebergs if you have big ice sheets. So so you can use these IRDs or ice rafted debris as kind of an indication of when we start getting these a big ice sheet that is marine terminating and is dynamically active and so on and so forth. So the first real peak of IRDs kind of off the coast of Canada happens maybe 118 or so thousand years before present. If we look off the coast of Svalbard, so the blue dot on the right, we don't see this initial peak, but we have a peak around 115. So there's a time delay between the kind of western and eastern North Atlantic. If we look off the coast of Norway, we don't see either of those peaks, but we have another peak, maybe 112 or so thousand years before present. So there's yet another time delay. And then if we go even further south, then we don't see either of these peaks, and we will see a bigger peak, later on. So this suggests that there is this time progression from first we get ice in Canada, then we start to get ice in kind of in the Arctic, and then it moves down into the into Scandinavia, and then perhaps even down to the British Isles. But there is this time delay of several thousand years. So this is consistent with the picture of ice forming first in Canada and then later on the eastern side of the ocean basin. In the paper, I'm going into more other types of proxies that cannot support this picture even further. So I think I'm out of time here. So in the interest of time, I was going to leave this my conclusion slide up, and I'm happy to take a few questions. But again, the main conclusion is that ice in Canada seems to be a key prerequisite for ice formation in Scandinavia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Do we have any questions?
So I do have a question, and that is, so how much freshwater fluxes are going into the Baffin Bay compared to east of Greenland?
You mean in the like in the modern climate?
No, in your simulation. So you do have, I mean, you do have the Labradors there, and my understanding is you still have ocean there, and so there should be also some freshwater fluxes into the Labradors.
Yeah, so there is a, maybe I can just go back to that figure. So we have the, can you see my cursor?
Yeah.
So this branch of the freshwater flux, you know, this branch really is completely cut off. And this makes up, I don't have the exact fraction fresh in my mind, but it's a substantial fraction of the total freshwater flux that comes across Bering Strait. But when we close this thing off, then the freshwater is really routed around Greenland like this. So it kills off the deep convection here. We still have freshwater fluxes coming from, say, calving events from Greenland and so on.
Yeah, that is what I mean. Yeah. So how much is that? I mean, how much does that contribute to the freshening?
That's a great question. I haven't looked at that specifically, so I can't give you an answer. But my gut feeling is that it's pretty small compared to the freshwater across Bering Strait, and that is routed east of Greenland.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, question from Lauren now.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Marcus. It was a very interesting presentation. I'm wondering if you've managed to also use your full domain with any other time period or any other installation. Have you managed to run on the present day installation or last interglacial to see if the model wants to grow ice in the similar places or different places, or not at all?
I haven't looked at that, but that's it's actually a topic for a follow-up study that we're hopefully going to start in the fall, perhaps. We're going to try to do a transient simulation, basically starting from the end of the simulation that Leah presented, and then run through the whole integration phase. So it's going to start at maybe 120 and go to like 110 or something like that. It's going to be a transient force simulation. So that would be one application of this. I haven't looked at the modern climate or pre-industrial climate, but that's a potential simulation to run as well, just to kind of see what it would do with the modern climate. I should say that we only get inception where we have perennial snow cover. So I would expect that we will probably get some ice in northern Canada and on islands in Siberia, but probably not ice in, say, Scandinavia or elsewhere, because we don't really have perennial snow cover in those regions in the modern climate.
Yeah, I guess that's a good way of diagnosing things. Okay, very interesting. Thank you.
Okay, next question from Andreas, please.
Hi, Marcus. Nice talk. I wonder about the AMOG changes. So how much does the AMOG overall change when you cut off that flow through the Canadian archipelago?
So the AMOG actually increases in the 116K simulation because it's a colder simulation, so we get more sea ice in the Arctic and we don't really melt the sea ice as much. So the AMOG is strengthening in that simulation compared to pre-industrial, but then when we cut off the freshwater through the archipelago, it kind of goes back to similar to kind of the pre-industrial simulation. The northern part of the AMOG, the part kind of up here in the Nordic seas, is like pretty much gone, and it has to do with freshwater fluxes, coming from the Arctic, but also sea ice expansion, and then the sea ice margin is so you basically form a bunch of sea ice up in the Arctic, and it's transported down into the Nordic seas, and then it melts, and then it kind of kills off the deep convection up in the Nordic seas. So this part of the AMOG circulation is pretty much gone when we close the archipelago. at lower latitudes, it's kind of more similar to the pre-industrial simulation.
Okay, one more question from Aaliyah before we move to the next talk.
Thanks, Marcus. Really interesting talk. I was just curious, you mentioned in your initialization that you removed all mountain glaciers so that there weren't any seeding points. And I was wondering if you did any tests or if you have a feeling of how leaving in some of those glaciers would affect the overall results of where you get ice growing for the inception.
That's a great question. I've not done that test. That could be a potential test to run at some point. I should say that these simulations are pretty expensive, so try to run as few simulations as possible. But I guess that's a good point, and it's something that could and probably should be done at some point.
All right, Marcus, thank you very much again for your talk.
Thank you.
Our next speaker, last speaker of the morning, is Alex Robinson, joining us from Madrid, who will be talking about simulating the Greenland ice sheet isochrones. So Alex, if you're able to share your screen.
Okay, yeah, I'm getting there. Thanks, Bill. I think I've got it here.
Yep, you can see it.
Yeah, great, okay. So yeah, thanks for inviting me to give a talk here. I'll make a disclaimer because it's a bit different than many of the other talks here. So first, it's going to be standalone ice sheet modeling. And also the resolution is going to be much lower than all these really beautiful plots we've been seeing at 4 kilometers. We're going to be running on a straight 32 kilometers, kind of a classic ice sheet modeling topography. But I think it's enough to kind of really have some interesting results. And although I'm only simulating the ice sheet, I'm going to make some links to the climate side, because I think there's a lot that can be done on the paleoclimate side that can go in this direction. So, and I should point out that this is work I've been working on together with Andreas Born up in Norway, and we have a paper now in review on this if you want to take a look in the cryosphere. So I'll start out maybe just by defining what is the englacial stratigraphy. Actually, there's several names floating around for this term, but it's essentially the layers of the ice sheet as we see them. So we all know that an ice sheet is essentially just built up by accumulation of snow falling and compressing into ice layers. And those are building up one after the other. And what's beautiful is with all the advances in ice core technology and methods, combined with really impressive data sets from the remote sensing side of things, you can get some really interesting results. And I think this is a really beautiful paper by Joe McGregor in 2015, where basically, well, this plot here is showing, for example, an algorithm that's able to pick out some of these, what they call isochronel layers. So this englacial stratigraphy, basically with the same color kind of linking up with the same layer across a range of the ice sheet. This is just a particular slice in northwest Greenland. But what's really neat is combining that with really precise records at the deep ice cores. You can come up with actually a 3D map of the isochrones of the Greenland ice sheet. So far, it's only been done for the Greenland ice sheet. As far as I understand, it's underway for Antarctica as well. And here's a really nice figure that they produced showing kind of these different age horizons within Greenland. So just a slice in the middle, you have the Holocene as this green period. And you can see that Holocene is 12 kiloyear, and that's reaching down in some places to 50% or more of the depth of the ice sheet. Then you have the last ice age, that's kind of more compressed into this intermediate range here. And then finally, in some locations, particularly in the north, there's still some Eemian ice. And so actually they've been able to reconstruct these layers of Eemian ice. So this is really neat. And I think it's really important for ice sheet modeling because it's a very, very unique constraint. It's a distribution that's only determined by ice dynamics, and there's no direct dependence on any other variable. So all the other proxies that we try to use to constrain our models are usually contaminated in some way by the climate. And so their interpretation is not really clear in all cases, and particularly for paleo data that's really sparse. This is really neat because this is saying that, you know, however you get it, the age of the ice at this, so these are 4 different isochronal layers, or isochrones as we call them. So layers of the same age. This is for the Holocene, and this is just the depth. So here where you have kind of higher accumulation rates, it's pushing that younger ice down further. And up in the north, you have much lower precipitation rates and slower flow. So that's kind of keeping them at shallower depths. This is for 29 kiloyears, 57 kiloyears, and 115. So this is kind of where we're seeing the last remnants of Eemian ice there, and that could be a good target for finding Eemian ice. So this could really be a powerful constraint for ice sheet models, because however you get the ice there, you know that it has to arrive at these depths with this age. And there's only so many ways that you can achieve that in a realistic setting. So we want to try to simulate that with the ice sheet model and see what we can learn from that. And so this is a really preliminary effort to just kind of prove the concept. And we're doing it with a couple of tools we developed. We have the Yamo ice sheet model that we developed in my group that got published last year. And it's like many other hybrid or intermediate complexity ice sheet models, but it's been designed for long time scale and ensemble simulations and coupling with climate models in the future. And internally, we have this Eulerian age tracing scheme. So basically, we're keeping track of the age on the 3D grid inside of Yamo on a static grid. We know actually that type of scheme is subject to some numerical diffusion, so it's not necessarily optimal. We're also, of course, treating all the additional processes like isostatic rebound and climatic forcing and oceanic melt, but these are all external components. So this is kind of the domain we're looking at. And really, prognostically, we're only looking at the ice sheet and everything else, well, and also the isostatic rebound. But the atmosphere and the ocean forcing are being prescribed. And then we've coupled this model. Really, we're driving what we call an isochronal model. It has a code name Pancakes because we haven't, or Andreas hasn't come up with the real name he wants to give to it yet. Maybe Pancakes will stick, I don't know. But you can imagine it's just because it's building up layers. So this is a layer tracing model, and this is showing some results he did with a 2D version of that. Where he basically just was depositing delta O18 signals at the surface and then tracing those as layers down into the depth. So just to give a quick overview of that, I mean, this may be something familiar to most of you, but basically the difference here is that instead of this Eulerian approach, which again is internal to Yamo and many other ice sheet models, where you basically have accumulation added here, and then you're kind of tracing an age through the grid. In the Pancakes approach, you're basically just adding a new layer every time you have some accumulation. And so you never have any vertical flow between layers. Rather, those layers are just getting compressed thinner and thinner until potentially they disappear. And so you kind of have to think about it that the vertical resolution is in time rather than in space. And so the layer resolution here is 200 years, that a new layer of a given thickness that's proportional to accumulation is deposited every 200 years in the model. Okay, so moving forward with that, just to go over the experimental design briefly. As I mentioned, it's a standalone ice sheet model, so we're doing kind of a classic index forcing approach. We're going to run a transient ice sheet from 160 kiloyear ago until the present day. That's at 32 kilometer resolution, so that we can do a lot of simulations. That's our primary goal right now. And it's important to do this long time scale because we're interested in ages all through the glacial period. So we need to be depositing those age layers throughout this entire time period. And then the index method we use is the standard one where we have a present day climatology from MAR. And then we use the LGM PMIP3 mean for the temperatures during the LGM, and also the elevation is corrected there. And the same for precipitation, although that's a scaling factor that's a ratio. But we found that precipitation, of course, for these layers, as you might have guessed with the accumulation rate, controlling layer thickness is a really critical input to modeling these age layers. So what we decided to do, rather than just taking the mean precipitation field from PMIP3, we also took standard deviation from that. And what we did was we came up with a kind of a scaling parameter where we could explore different values of LGM precipitation that we're feeding into this index method. So higher or lower precipitation LGM. We also found that it's really important what precipitation we're putting in the Holocene. So on top of this index method that's coming from present day and LGM, we additionally have a scaling factor multiplied with an index for the Holocene, and I'll show that here, which is basically that it does nothing until we reach about 12 kiloyear before today, and then we ramp that up for basically the mid-Holocene warm period. We want to assume that maybe we had a bit more precipitation than we're getting in our simple index method, and then that decays down to the present day rate again. This is the climatic index used for scaling temperatures, the black line. And we're also forcing by sea level. And you can see this abrupt jump in sea level around 12 kiloyear. So there's two innovative things that I want to talk about in our approach that I'm pretty happy about, and I'll try to go quickly through that. One is that it's important to discuss the enhancement factor, which is kind of this flow tuning parameter that's usually used in ice sheet models. A lot of times it's set as a constant value over the whole ice sheet. But we know that glacial ice tends to flow a bit faster, and interglacial ice tends to flow a bit slower, sorry. And also the flow regime can affect that as well. So we came up with an approach, where we basically have an enhancement factor that's a spatial 3D field. We have one reference enhancement factor, which is basically a weighted average between whether we're in a shearing regime or a streaming regime. So we kind of assume that when we're shearing, we have a higher enhancement factor. And then when we're in fast flowing ice streams, this gets to a lower value. And then we actually have a tracer field that we're vectoring through the ice sheet that's keeping track of the age using that Eulerian scheme, essentially. It's an Eulerian scheme, but rather than tracing age, it's tracing the enhancement factor value that we're depositing at the surface. And that's a weighted average of this index value following this red line here. So we basically assume that we have a glacial enhancement factor here, and otherwise when we reach present day, we're depositing an interglacial one. So what's really neat is that we have 3D structure in our enhancement factor. So you can see that deeper ice is showing a higher enhancement factor here for this particular simulation, around 3 at depths. As you get to ice streams, then that diminishes again because streams tend to break up the flow direction of the crystals. And then Holocene age ice is flowing slower with a lower enhancement factor. The second thing that we needed to do is that we realized that to be able to really learn something about the isochrones, because it turns out that it's really hard to get them in a good position, is that we needed to arrive at a pretty good present day state. But we wanted to have enough degrees of freedom as well. So we're using a simple linear friction law. This is the friction coefficient in the model, and it's just a spatial field CB divided by constant U0 and multiplied by the effective pressure rho GH. So this U0 is prescribed, but this CB can take any value between 0 and 1. And we basically follow an optimization strategy. This is simply the strategy proposed by Dave Pollard. And what we do is first of all, we optimize our CB for a steady state present day simulation. Then we choose which model parameters we're going to run for a given simulation. And then we run for 20 kiloyears with LGM boundary conditions to kind of get ourselves into an LGM state. And then this is where we start doing the optimization. We run transiently from LGM to present day. And when we arrive at present day, we see how good CB is giving us for ice thickness at present day. And we repeat that 10 times. And then finally, we're ready with our optimized CB to run a transient simulation from 160 kiloyears to present day. So this is just to give you an idea. This was our kind of initially optimized CB. Well, here I called it CF, sorry. And this was the error we were getting arriving at present day. So way too thin, almost more than 500 meters too thin here, and 400 meter root mean square error. And after 10 iterations, you can see that the friction got a lot stronger and our ice thickness error improved quite a bit. So we're down to 169. So that helped us a lot. Just to give you an idea in the transient, these are our 10 iterations, and you can see that they kind of converge, or at least I would say they don't improve any further. And then we end with that. And when we do our transient simulation, what you see is actually a totally different structure, because then you've got the thermal memory of the ice sheet and the forcing over this glacial period, but then it arrives to a very similar present day. So it does the job for us. So with that, maybe kind of lengthy introduction, sorry for going through it quickly. This is just to show you snapshots of the ice sheets. We get around 21 kiloyears, so with a really extended grounding line and kind of a flattened out ice sheet. And then present day, we get something quite similar to the present day extent. So then we can look at some ensemble results. And I think a first result that would be pretty obvious to anybody. So these are the ensemble. I'm just looking at ice thickness now as a metric. We're able to get a pretty good optimal simulation if we're only trying to match present day ice thickness. And that's pretty obvious given that we were optimizing the basal friction precisely for that field. So you can see that this is the error we're getting for kind of our best simulation when we match the ice, but also for all parameters. So for each of these dots, we've optimized our friction field, and you can see that not all of them do as well as others. So there's definitely more information from these parameters. The parameters we're looking at here, this is the Holocene precipitation scaling. So 0.2 means that at the maximum, we're giving 0.2 meters per year additional precipitation in the Holocene. This is the scaling of the mean LGM precipitation. And you can see that those are the dominant signals we get in our optimization. And these are the most relevant for climate. So this is kind of where I tie it in to coupled climate modeling, because it's going to be really important to get these fields right. The rest of these are kind of more ice sheet modeling. So this is a PDD factor that doesn't seem to do a lot. That's more related to the margins that we're not really interested in here. Geothermal heat flux, and then these two enhancement factor values that we use. What's interesting is to see that when we optimize for ice thickness, this is the same plot I was showing before, we do great for the ice thickness, but actually we do very poorly at simulating the depth of the isochrones. This is just showing the one for the Holocene. But you can see that we're off by more than 300 meters in terms of the depth there. But what we can do is that instead of picking the simulation that matches the ice thickness best, we can pick the simulation that matches all the layers best. And so that's this one here, that's best all. And you can see it does actually a bit poorer for ice thickness, although it still does pretty good. But it's much improved for simulating the depth of the isochrones as well. So you can see that already we're getting some information from that. Here I'm kind of showing, now this is the root mean square error values for all the isochrones as we go down in depth. And this is now the optimized curves for when we look at all the information we have. And you can see again that throughout all the layers, definitely the Holocene precipitation is a really critical input to getting this right, because basically the Holocene precipitation is what's pushing everything down. You know, we said that Holocene ice can be up to 50% of the thickness. So that's a really critical factor. But also the LGM precipitation, particularly for the deeper layers, plays a big role. This is looking at it just in terms of the ice cores, and I'm going to try to sum it up here. So this is the 5 ice cores: Di3, Summit, North Crypt, Neem, and East Crypt. You can see as we go further north, our approach is doing better. So black is from the data from the ice cores, and this thick blue line is our best simulation when we're using all the layers. And you can see that they're able to do a pretty good job, although much poorer as we go further south. There's a lot less isochronal information in the south, so it could be that we're optimizing for this region. Likewise, it's interesting to see this is the green line is when we just picked the simulation that did best for only ice thickness. And this just reflects what we saw in the 2D maps, that the fit is much poorer as we go to depth. And then finally, an interesting side note is to say that if you take this blue simulation, but you look at the ages using the Eulerian tracer model instead of the pancakes model, you see that they're not the same. They're showing an offset here. And so that Eulerian tracing model is definitely showing some deficiencies compared to the layer tracing scheme. Although it's better than nothing, you know, if you have that, you're getting some first order information. So to conclude there, I think that we can see that isochronal layers really do provide valuable information for training the simulation. But the devil is really in the details. So there's a lot of information there, and it's not going to be, I think, as easy to simulate these well. And it's going to put a higher demand on getting the boundary conditions right from the climate side and from transient simulations. Using Eulerian tracing methods, this leads to some biases, but it definitely also depends on the vertical resolution. So actually in the pancakes model, we had kind of thousands of layers, whereas in the Eulerian model, we only had 20 layers. So that could be something to look at. But it's definitely a useful first order check. So that means that all ice sheet models really can, and they definitely should simulate ice sheet models, especially when we're doing transient simulations. Particularly if you're doing a transient simulation from LGM to present day, when you arrive at present day, you can look at the isochronal layers in the top 50% of the ice sheet and really gain information about how well your simulation matched reality over that time period. And lastly, precipitation is really a critical input here. Andreas Born is working on some inverse modeling approaches that might be able to help us disentangle some of those effects. Thank you, that's it.
Alex, thanks for a very interesting talk. Do we have questions? I see we have, Gunter, your hand is raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi Alex, thanks for a great presentation here. And I think, well, you touched on one of my first questions in the conclusion here. First one was, how many ice layers do you have in your model outside of the pancake model? I think you just said 20, is that right?
Right. Yeah, so I mean, yeah. Do you have more to the question?
Do you know how sensitive the number of layers is to...
For the Eulerian tracer or for the ice sheet in general?
For the Eulerian tracer. For the
Eulerian tracer. I mean, it's definitely really sensitive to that. So I could imagine that, I don't know, having 100 Eulerian layers, this could certainly improve things significantly. This numerical diffusion that happens is also really spatially dependent. So I mean, it's not going to be everywhere. Where you have kind of slower flowing, and maybe at the domes, maybe this is going to be less critical. But the main issue we have in Yamo, and I think in most ice sheet models right now, is probably that this Eulerian tracer is working on the same grid that we're solving thermodynamics. And that's one thing I'm going to be thinking about in the future, is if those can be decoupled vertically. So you could be tracing the age at kind of a much higher vertical resolution without having to simulate your ice sheet necessarily at such a high vertical resolution.
And I have a couple of follow-up questions on this. And does the Stokes approximation impact the ice tracing?
Say that again, sorry?
Does the Stokes approximation impact?
That's a really good question. Right now, all we were doing was a standard kind of hybrid model simulation, so SIA plus SSA. And, you know, we were tuning the basal friction, so that kind of contaminates some kind of interpretation there. But I would like to do it with a different solver, like the Diva solver. And I think that there could be some different results there, but I haven't looked into it yet in this approach.
And my last question, is how expensive is the pancake model?
The pancake model right now is fairly expensive. It's pretty expensive, especially as you get up to a few thousand layers. Then it's, I mean, it's a cheap model. The problem is that to maintain that high fidelity to the ages, you need a lot of layers. We're working together with Andreas. We're working on kind of updating that model interface so that you can do variable layer thickness and time. So if there are periods of time that you're not that interested in, you don't have to be depositing so many layers. And that should, that and a few other tricks should be able to speed it up quite a bit. So, I mean, overall, I don't think it should add a significant strain on other models. And it can be driven offline if you have a lot of output. The problem is that you should be saving your, your 3D horizontal velocity fields relatively frequently. But if you do that, you can drive such a model offline as well.
Thanks.
Do we have any other hands up? I was just going to, following up on Gunter's question, Alex, as you know, the DIVA model scales really nicely with the number of layers. Mm-hmm. Since you're solving for the mean velocity and that's most of your work, I would think we could go from 10 or 20 to more layers pretty easily without increasing the cost. Also, for your Eulerian scheme, we're using a first order remapping method for your tracer?
For the Eulerian scheme, it's second order upwind, but it's still, at least in some numerical tests, it shows some diffusion.
So it's still pretty diffusive, even second order. Okay.
Yeah. And about your comment for the dynamic side, I'm not too worried, but at least in Yamo, the thermodynamics are still linked to that. I only have one parameter for number of vertical layers. And so I think that might increase the cost of the thermodynamic solver a bit. So that's why I'm considering kind of decoupling that, allowing different numbers of vertical layers for different components of the ice sheet.
Right. Heiko.
Yeah, hi, Alex. Thanks for the talk. I was wondering, with what you're presenting now, you can run this as 32 kilometer resolution or a very long time scale. So it's kind of excluding a whole number of models that don't have that possibility to run over such long times. So I was just wondering if you have a perspective of how that can be used for other models that don't have the capability to go so far back.
No, I mean, you hit on a really key point that that I wanted to mention, and it's and I think it's the $1 million question, because one, I think these are really powerful constraints, but they have one fatal flaw, is that they really only have value when you arrive at present day in a transient fashion. So the $1 million question for me is, how can you kind of step those snapshots back so that you can say, okay, what did the age distribution look like at 20,000 years ago, or maybe at 120,000 years ago? So that's something I've been thinking about a lot. I think that there's some inverse modeling may help with that. But yeah, I think it would be really neat to be able to get kind of snapshots of our best estimate of what the age distribution would look like at a different point in time. And then that would allow other models to take advantage of that without maybe running an entire time scan.
I might have missed this in your talk, Alex, but did you have a isochronal validation data set?
Yeah, not for this 3D setup. So, but this paper from Andreas Born in 2016, his isochronal layer, that's kind of where he introduces it. And he shows some really nice validation tests showing some kind of like checkerboard tracer and things like that. And then also doing the delta 18. So actually what I showed, this figure here, this was simulating really the delta 18 signal through the grip ice core. And then he shows that putting that in at the surface, he's able to recover that from his model directly.
Okay, and is this available now in 3D?
It's available, it's almost available now in 3D. It's essentially, yeah, working in 3D. I think over the next couple months, we're going to be cleaning up the interface a little bit and then try to get that published maybe in GMD, and then it'll be out there, kind of plug and play.
Yeah, I was just thinking that, following up on our discussion yesterday about ice sheet diagnostics, a 3D isochronal data set would be very useful.
Definitely. Yeah, I think it's really neat. And I mean, here, for example, I focused on these 4 isochronal layers because those were kind of highlighted by Joe McGregor in his paper, but it's really a 3D map. It has all the age layers you want in there. And the younger ages are all the more high resolution. So I think it's going to be a real challenge, actually, to try to, it's going to show us how poorly maybe we've been simulating the ice sheet.
I always look forward to a good challenge.
Yeah.
Any more questions on Alex's talk before we move on to general discussion?
Alex, there are a couple of questions in the chat, so you may want to address them afterwards.
Okay, sure, yeah. Thanks.
Esther, would you like to? Okay, there you are.
I'm here.
How would you like to lead off the discussion period? I know you have some questions that you've drawn up.
Yeah, let me look at my.
And again, thanks to all the speakers. That was a really interesting set of talks that's going to have us thinking for a while about some of the top issues that were raised.
Excellent talk, Paul.
Yeah, I don't have that much. I do have one slide from our email exchange that we did yesterday. I can share that right now here. Make sure this works. Just that came out of our discussions that we had amongst the co-chairs yesterday, just whether there's feedback from the community on what new paleoclimate ice sheet, coupled climate ice sheet experiments that we could do as a joint land ice Paleoclimate Working Group project. And I think Betty had an idea about that. So.
Did you just ask me, Esther?
Yeah, you came back with some ideas, and Bill.
I don't know if I have so many ideas as we could use some feedback and from especially the ice sheet modelers here. The ISMIP project, when it met, came up with a series of simulations, both coupled climate ice sheet modeling and ice sheet only modeling. And they mainly concentrated on present or into the future. So you saw some presentations during the Land Ice Working Group from that. What happened?
Sorry.
Okay. Well, anyway, I'll keep talking. And it was decided it was too early to really considering using at least the CMIP6 models for paleoclimate then. We did include one where we were going to use the PMIP4 last interglacial simulations at 127 Ka to do standalone ice sheet simulations. But even that was a challenge because both 127 or the last interglacial and the mid-Holocene are kind of really transient responses of the ice sheets. Well, all time periods are, but in particular, transient to the orbital parameters. So how would you design even a simulation where you use the PMIP4 simulations for those two time periods to run standalone ice sheets? LGM might make more sense, but there are very few PMIP4 simulations. Mid-Pliocene, it's really a reduced ice sheet in Greenland and Antarctica. So that's a possibility, CO2 about what we are now. And what we didn't put here, but might be worth getting some input on is several models have now completed the last millennium, so 850 to present. So much smaller forcings, and then you have to worry about things like initialization and biases. So just, we wanted to think about some brainstorming if there are either use these PMIP4 simulations to force CESM, or alternatively use CESM results to force a number of standalone ice sheet models, and what would be needed from these climate simulations if we were going to do either any of those?
I could maybe make a comment if this is the moment.
Sure,
go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's an idea brought up maybe a little while ago with Bill and Gunther in an exchange, that I thought that your transient simulations with CESM now, depending on how much output you saved, maybe present a really interesting opportunity, because with your elevation class approach, as far as I understand it, it allows you to kind of explore different ice sheet topographies given kind of the same background climatic forcing. So of course you're kind of constrained to roughly a particular trajectory, but I could easily imagine using those elevation class forcing to do an ensemble of CISM standalone simulations with different ice sheet parameters that could allow you to kind of sample that uncertainty to some extent.
And not just CISM, but Yamo or any ice sheet model.
Right, any ice sheet model could really do that.
So what do ice sheet models need? Do they need like the surface mass balance components? Is that it to do these? What are they
for me? Not the annual surface mass balance and the annual temperature is enough from the climate model, I would say, and maybe oceanic temperature depending.
Heiko, have you given any thought to what we would need to do a Greenland ISMIP6 style experiment for the last interglacial or other paleo periods? If Heiko is still on.
Yeah, sorry, I just had to move to another room. So yeah, I'm kind of trying to think this, like we had a couple of ideas with Ayako and also Alex, I guess 2 years ago when we were thinking about ISMIP. And the one challenge that I see is that when it comes to paleo simulation, you kind of move a bit away from this approach that we have in ISMIP, that basically the forcing, preparation, everything is externalized. And so what the ice sheet modeler gets is just a set of forcings and can apply that. When you move to the paleo side, it's often that modelers are producing their own climate forcing. You've seen in Alex's presentation that what you do to the climate forcing is kind of an essential part of the game. So when we were talking at the time, I guess we were always thinking about an ice sheet model setup that includes to some extent the climate forcing. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking about at this moment. How to overcome that, or how to shift the focus to something else.
So how exactly would this be different? Let's say CESM provides surface mass balance as a function of elevation and X and Y. And I could also imagine, though I haven't talked with anyone about this, using that SMB forcing to force a regional climate model like MAR. But of course, that only works well if the ice sheet topography is fixed. So you could, if you're talking about thousands of years, then let's just say you take surface mass balance as a function of X, Y, and Z from CESM and provide that to modeling groups. Would that give modeling groups enough to do simulations of several thousand years, or are we missing some things there?
No, I think that would be possible. I'm wondering though if you know, if that's something that's best addressed with a MIP, because I think that's like Alex suggested. I think that's a very valuable experiment to kind of look a bit in a broader range than what is one example ice sheet configuration that this experiment produces now has given. But yeah, to go back to this, I think in a MIP, if you take away all the climate uncertainty and provide a certain forcing, I'm not expecting a lot of range of how the ice sheets respond, because the forcing is really what drives the situation here. And when we think about this configuration from the last interglacial into inception, there's not even much marine-based ice left. And so basically the SMB that you prescribe will tell you much of what will come out. So I think it's a very valuable experiment, but I'm wondering if the MIP is kind of what you want to target with that. Maybe it's worthwhile to just do that with CESM and you know, do something in the Land Ice Working Group. Yeah.
Hey, Lauren.
Yeah, actually, on this topic, I guess there's one thing to keep in mind when using the 3D surface mass balance in an offline mode, is there's still some feedbacks that are missing. So it's you still get a different response. So it's tricky to use in situations where we expect a lot of change in ice sheets. But in a situation where we're close to an equilibrium, I'm thinking, for example, LGM, because I'm used to thinking about that, but particularly in North American ice sheet, if we get a simulation where we have an equilibrium between the climate and the ice sheet, and an ice sheet close enough to reconstruction, then having a MIP of ice sheet only experiments using that 3D surface mass balance is valuable for thinking about ice sheet dynamics. And the way in which we represent subglacial processes in different models, and the effects of resolution or all of these things. I think there's value in doing that, because we're not expecting the geometry of the ice sheets to be massively different, the climate being the constant thing, but those subglacial conditions might be different.
Alex, and then Betty.
Did I have more? I don't think I meant to.
Oh, I'm sorry. You have your hand raised from a while back.
It's still there raised, I guess.
Okay, I unraised it. Betty.
But I liked all the discussion. I just didn't have any more thing right now to say. Yeah.
So I had a question for Lauren then. In what you're proposing, would it need to be an LGM simulation with an ice sheet predicted by the climate, or would LGM simulations where you prescribe the ice sheet but save all the surface mass balances, I guess, or elevation classes?
So I think the safest is to have a simulation coupled with an ice sheet model. Because that way we can get to a climate that is in equilibrium with a dynamical ice sheet, which is something difficult to do if we're prescribing from a reconstruction, because then there might be some big differences between what the surface mass balance had originally seen and what the dynamical models will do. So if we can sort of get into the configuration where we have we're limiting the differences in the ice sheet geometry and topography, I think that would be interesting. But I mean, maybe I'm going on the wrong track, and maybe others would disagree with that.
No, I would say I would totally agree with Lauren here that it's. I think the most value would be when you have it fully coupled, because for basically the same reasons, yeah, that you know that that's a dynamically valid ice sheet and climate configuration, and then you can kind of perturb a little bit from there. And then if you imagine that this is eventually an effort that other potential coupled climate models could do as well, I think having diversity in, for example, LGM climates that are accurate with a diversity of topographies would only help to learn more.
So are we thinking here about having multiple ESMs do this transient LGM simulation with a dynamic ice sheet and then saving the output and using that output in a subsequent set of experiments with standalone models? Is that the general idea?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got the feeling that's what we're discussing.
Okay.
So Bill, what do you mean by transient? Are you talking about LGM to present then? I mean, it's hard enough, as Mirren showed, to even get LGM right, and there's very few PMIP4 LGM simulations.
So yeah, so I suppose LGM would be sufficient. So the transient simulation, well, it could be an equilibrium LGM simulation, but with an evolving ice sheets.
Yeah, I would make a comment there because I was really surprised. Actually, I have a paper on Antarctica doing simulations at the LGM. And I was kind of really surprised to see that almost nobody yet who's doing standalone paleo ice sheet modeling has been forcing with, for example, like the mean PMIP, even the PMIP3. So we were the first ones, it looks like, or one of the first ones to be forcing our ice sheet at the LGM with a PMIP3 climate instead of just kind of a present day scaled by some index everywhere. So yeah, I think there's, we're at that stage still where having some snapshot climates, but that are, really good, would be really valuable for standalone ice sheet modeling, I think. What the precise methodology is to apply those, I'm not quite sure, but yeah, I'm all for diversity in equilibrium snapshots at different times.
So it sounds like, just kind of summarizing here what I've heard, and then others can, is rather than trying to make this too big, like PMIP or ISMIP, is a smaller MIP like the ice sheet modelers have done very well, where they, I don't know what they were all called anymore, MISOMIP, and but yeah, a smaller group and a smaller focus than something. ISMIP was very big focus, as was PMIP.
And so the idea would be we would have climate model output from PMIP configurations, let's say associated with the LGM, and we would save the surface mass balance in elevation classes, and that could be used to subsequently force an ice sheet model. And we would have multiple, or at least two ESMs providing the surface mass balance, maybe more.
I don't know. I heard different things. I heard that, but I also heard we really need to have the ice sheet simulated, not prescribed. Because all the models will give the same. I don't know. SMB, I don't know. Maybe Alex and Lauren and Heiko can explain to me better what we should do.
Yeah, I'm not sure we're quite at the point of having a ice sheet model that we think has sufficient physics and is well enough tuned to represent the LGM ice sheet so well.
Yeah, I can see.
So
I mean, if you're not at that stage, certainly having the climatic input would be interesting. I mean, what we get from PMIP3 was not even surface mass balance. You just get some monthly temperature and monthly precipitation snapshot, and then we have to convert that via PDD or whatever. So already having an XYZ of surface mass balance and temperature, I would say, if that's coming out, that would be a real upgrade, even if you were using a static ice sheet, I think.
I think other simulations would be maybe of interest and maybe could be an analog for the future would be kind of transient where we have a rapid change of the climate like the Younger Dryas or other times 8K event. I think that may be an interesting time to simulate. I want to have the trace simulation to probably branch out the climate out of some of these simulations.
I was wondering if you're still online, if Mirren or Sarah Bradley has any thoughts about LGM simulations, equilibrium and transient, and their value for the kind of MIPS we're talking about. Mirren and Sarah are still online, but it is starting to get late there.
Mm-hmm.
I can just comment while we wait for them to get their microphones going or come back. We also hope, though it's basically people time that's slowing us down, to start a simulation very similar to the transient LIG, but for the Holocene. So starting at probably about 9 Ka, but people can tell us if that's something we shouldn't do, partly because how do you start the ocean? And so we hope to use trace to start the ocean or iTrace. But let the Greenland ice sheet, again, just Greenland ice sheet, we'd probably prescribe the remnants of the Laurentide. So it's kind of in the planning. We've done a lot of thinking, but hasn't started yet.
Maybe Sarah wrote in the chat.
Oh, okay. Sarah writes, I think the suggestions of a fully coupled LGCM plus ice sheet is excellent, but there are 3 years as shown it is complicated, very much so. The problem we're thinking is how to spin up the ice sheet in much more than 10,000 years in a fully coupled run. And Lauren had to go for kids' bedtime and thanks us for an interesting discussion. So we should definitely follow up with her later. I have a question for John, if he's on.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So the simulations you've been doing lately showing that CESM2 is too sensitive for paleoclimate simulation generally. Mm-hmm. Where do you see that going in the next couple of years? Do you see us having a CESM 2 point something, which is in some way better designed for paleoclimate runs? And should we be waiting for that before we do some of these experiments, or do you think it's okay to be using the model we have?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think as my analysis shown that a lot of the difference is made by the atmosphere model. So we really need to interact with them. And the cloud feedback is important in generating this model difference we see between CAM5 and CAM6. And the paleo constraint is not the only constraint. Maybe that's the less important constraint in terms of cloud processes than other constraints like satellite observations. So we need to interact with them. We need to consider multiple lines of constraints in order to really better constrain the overall climate sensitivity. And at the same time, I think maybe it's worth exploring alternative settings than the out-of-box CESM2 configuration. So we have some idea trying to basically lower the climate sensitivity and at the same time try to make it agree better with multiple lines of constraints. So if needed, we can explore those settings. But I'm not sure it's supported by, say, the Atmosphere Working Group. Because it's hard to get a really perfect set of simulation.
Oh, absolutely. I guess I know, I forget what exactly you've done, but I know you've tried altering one or two of the key cloud parameters, and in that way can reduce the overall climate model sensitivity. And probably there are other metrics that are then degraded when you do that. But I'm wondering if an approach like that, taken a little bit farther with a bit more input from the atmosphere folks, if we could get it, might result in, let's say, not CESM3 fully vetted, but a 2 point something, which is better for paleo and has a lower equilibrium climate sensitivity. And at least someone has said it doesn't too much degrade the other things that we care about. And if that's something we could discuss at the upcoming co-chair meetings, perhaps.
Yeah, that's something we are aiming for.
Well, I know some of us would like to redo some of the simulations we already did for CMIP with a less sensitive atmosphere.
So Bill, I raised my hand. I don't think anyone else did. So just wanted to follow up with what Jean just said. He's going to give a talk next week at the Paleo Working Group meeting on this. I think that's what your talk is about. He has many research projects. So you could tune into that, or if you can't, you can see the slides after. And as Mirren mentioned, his paper on this, some of the things she showed, is out in GRL already. So you can also just look for his name or my name, if that's maybe easier to search on. There's only one of me. And you'll find that paper. And what was encouraging as he goes through this is you can run CESM2 with CAM5. And what that gives you is you still get everything else that's new. You can couple to CESM, you can you get CLM5, you get a lot of the other features that were really important. And then my third comment is it's not all paleoclimate periods that we find challenging. It's ones where we've kind of pushed the system to much higher or much lower CO2, or even Pliocene CO2 is right on the edge. It doesn't seem to, if you're close enough to present, like last millennium or some of the orbital, it seems to be okay. It's this feedbacks with the clouds when you really push the system with higher low CO2. So just something to remember. So it does affect the future, of course, because we're going into much higher CO2.
And John, thank you for putting the link in the chat box. Andreas, you have your hand up.
Yes, I guess I was, for John, if there are modifications to CESM2 or CAM6 regarding the climate sensitivity lowering, that would be useful. But I think also useful would be to see if that can be realized in the lower resolution version of the model, and if there, just because of equilibration of coupled ice sheet climate models, may be easier with the 2 degree versus the 1 degree version of the model, and so that people could use that kind of lower resolution version.
Yeah, that's a good comment. Right now, we are working on both versions, so the 1 degree and 2 degree. Hopefully, we can find a consistent set solution for the two versions.
Partly the reason we're doing that is there are people that want to look at things like ozone or chemistry. So we'd like a Wacom version, Wacom 6 version that you could use for LGM or other paleoclimates. And then you'd have to run at lower resolution. There's no other way.
Yeah. And our last millennium PMIP4 simulation is with the FV2 Wacom. That's correct, right? Yeah, yeah.
Esther, did you have any more topics you wanted to bring up during discussion?
No, not really. I think this has been quite interesting. So we do have a couple of our projects in the latest CSL allocation are joint land ice working group projects. So we are working together on some things. And also we do have plans for testing coupled CESM with the FV2 simulation for longer transient type simulations as well. So these are all kind of projects in the works. So.
Heiko, he says he's off from pancakes to fish cakes. Thank you. Thank you for joining us, Heiko. Do we have any other comments or questions before we adjourn for the day? So Esther, when does the Paleo group convene next?
We are meeting Monday and Tuesday next week. We start early because we have some speakers who are very remote in their day from our day in Boulder. So we're starting at 8:30 to accommodate some speakers. So please join us. And you can use, I think the same, yeah, you should be able to use the same Zoom link information for those meetings as well.
Which Elizabeth has just posted in the chat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could we put those up on the screen here quick for people?
Let me see if I have one.
Or maybe Elizabeth can do it faster.
Maybe. Let's see.
Also try.
And Elizabeth has just posted the Zoom link and passcode.
Yeah, I think everyone who registered for this meeting
should have the link.
Has the same link.
Yeah.
Oh.
I just figured it'd be easier to people to quick see now. Yeah. What are the? I may have it myself. Here.
Wait. Okay. I have it here.
You have it. Okay. Otherwise, I can post it for you.
Get it going here.
Yeah, I put the Zoom link in the chat for the people that are in the meeting, and anyone that's watching on YouTube, you can just go to the meeting website and register again if you need to, and that will put you right into the meeting directly.
Okay, Esther, I just did it. If I can bring this up now. Okay, here it is. So Monday, I'm going to talk about it, Esther. It's up. You want to talk about it? Oh,
no. Yeah, we start with a keynote from Axel Timmerman on Monday. He's talking about a 2 million year long transient paleoclimate simulation. And then another talk from Liaoning follows on multi-scale climate variability during the Holocene with new simulations from the CESM. I don't know if I should go through all. Andreas is going to be giving a talk. He's with us right now, or he was just a little while ago, on the glacial deep ocean deoxygenation driven by increased air-sea disequilibrium. Let's see, Jean is giving his talk at about 10 a.m., updating us on the simulation of the LGM using CESM2. And we cover talks ranging from, deep time talks. Arnie's giving a talk on Tuesday on marine, productivity and dissolved oxygen at the PETM. We also have a keynote on Tuesday from Young Hu at Peking University on the evolution of the monsoon system over the past 250 million years. So we have talks from deep time through the Holocene. Deepak Chandan's giving a talk on African, the humid period, precipitation sustained by robust vegetation and other land surface feedbacks. We also have some talks on new model developments that will be great for paleoclimate applications. We have a talk on the development of a sediment diagenesis model called MED-USA that has been coupled to CESM 1.2 from the Bremen group given by Takasumi Kurahashi Nakamura. And then Altug Kisi in Bern, working with Fortunat Joost, is giving a talk on carbon isotope enabled simulations with CESM2, where they've developed some carbon isotope tracers for CAM. So it should be pretty interesting set of talks. I hope everyone can join us.
And I'll just add, since Esther didn't, she's scheduled right after we finish on Tuesday, anyone that wants to stay to bring their lunch or their dinner, wherever they are, breakfast, to just discuss, chat, and Dan Lund did this after the deep meeting, and it was very informative. A smaller group, but just brainstorm on some things or just ask questions. So be sure to bring your lunch or whatever you want.
Coffee break chats that we had when we met in person. Find out what people are doing that aren't giving talks and things like that. So that's a chance.
Right, so shall we wrap it up